I think, look, my takeaway from this is just, like, you can't really argue too much that George has come in to Lewis's, what it has been, regardless of what anyone wants to say, Lewis's team, right? Like, it was Lewis's team. He's come into Lewis's team, a 7-time world champion alongside him, a 7-time world champion who I think we all agree is not at his peak anymore, but it's not like he's way off it. He has been very, very good, and on his day, he has been very, very good. And George has held his own the whole way through. And there's been instances where George has been just clearly the better driver.
Lewis Hamilton versus George at Mercedes. I mean, just a bit of a brief. I mean, yeah, the main head-to-head is something that you know it already, I guess. They're almost head-to-head. They're almost level when it comes to race finishes.
Oh, okay.
In qualifying, George is 10 ahead. I think it's 39-29. That big a gap. But I think it's actually interesting if you look at some other key figures, right? So I made the list for it. In terms of points, it's just a 2-point difference. 2-point difference. 697 for Lewis, 695 for George.
Yeah.
Podiums, Lewis has 20, George has 14.
Okay.
Pole positions, Lewis has 1, George has 5. Race wins, Lewis has 2, George has 3. And the rest, again, qualifying and races I already spoke about, the head-to-head. The one key takeaway that I feel is that when a big result is there in the offing, when the car is working, Lewis tends to take the edge. The 20 podiums compared to 14, they show a bit. Of course, there are also other factors in play, because even this season we can take a look at at least 3 podiums that George lost due to reliability.
Yeah.
Then there have been others as well. But even then, 20 to 14 is a big difference.
We also need to remember
kind of shows that.
We also need to remember that, like, you know, one of them has just finished a title championship coming into 2022, you know, a 7-time world champion. The other one is getting his step up from Williams in 2022. So, of course, one is going to be more prepared to fight for podiums and wins than another one. And look, I think the thing is, like, this has been the only season, I would say, of the 3 where Hamilton has been notably like a worse driver, right? Like, he just hasn't been great this season, let's be honest. Like, you know, I'm sorry, Hamilton fans, but it's just not been a very good season. And that's
in my top 10 this season.
No, and that stacks to how good Hamilton is when you think about it, because even on a bad season, like what is probably one of his worst seasons, I'm trying to think if there has been a worse one, I'm sure.
2011.
Yeah.
2008 as well, by the way.
Yeah.
He had 7 races where he basically, out of 18, where he basically either crashed and something happened.
Yeah, so like even in his worst season, it's still 2 race wins, one of which realistically he may not have gotten if it wasn't for George taking a gamble and it not paying off. And the other of which, I think there's a good argument that even if George didn't DNF, he still would have won the race or could have won the race, but it probably would have been George and him on the podium, like one way or the other. So, like, still a very high level. I think, look, my takeaway from this is just, like, you can't really argue too much that George has come in to Lewis's, what it has been, regardless of what anyone wants to say, Lewis's team, right? Like, it was Lewis's team. He's come into Lewis's team, a 7-time world champion alongside him, a 7-time world champion who I think we all agree is not at his peak anymore, but it's not like he's way off it. He has been very, very good, and on his day, he has been very, very good. And George has held his own the whole way through. And there's been instances where George has been just clearly the better driver. I want to say Zandvoort was at 2023 when George made his own call onto the soft tires, for example, or maybe that was 2022. I can't remember.
2022.
Yeah, so you got that one. Like, you know, the call in Spa this year, you know, like to stay out. Sure, it backfired, but what a call, and like how it went on the track.
And the
like,
execution. The most important thing is the execution, right? So it's
Brazil this year, like fighting Norris, obviously the red flag didn't go in his favor either, and the strategy didn't go in his favor. But like George has been absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
You know?
for me, what stands out is that I think the biggest takeaway has to be the fact that George is an elite driver,
Yeah.
and a lot of people on social media, they have this habit of massaging the statistics and the numbers in a way to make one driver look better than the other. Look, the reality is that both of them are very elite drivers. Tomorrow, if you give them the best car on the grid, the championship is going to go down to the wire, and most probably it is going to be decided on the basis of who is more lucky.
Yeah.
Most of the times,
Yeah.
it's not going to be decided on, okay, there's going to be a lot of merit involved, but I think it's going to come down to the fact that who's been more lucky, and that's just how F1 sometimes works. And
Yeah.
I think that should be the key takeaway. I think the biggest thing is this was the litmus test that George had to pass, which sometimes drivers cannot. Because if somehow this season we'd seen the George of 2023, where he was making a lot of mistakes, I think people, they kind of underrate the 2023 season, because again, he made a lot of errors and something. There was a difference in his approach, because what he was doing in 2023 was he'd come from 2022, where he was a bit conservative. He was focused on getting the results, bringing the car home. That was his focus in 2022. In 2023, he was just trying to get the best possible result or a freak result from the car, and that meant he was just pushing too much
Yeah.
a lot of times, and that induced errors. Singapore is the perfect example. He was just too desperate, and you could
Yeah.
see it in his mannerisms and the way he was talking, that he wasn't really looking at the point standings. He was more looking at getting a win or a pole position and stuff like that. So when you take all that into consideration, maybe the season looks a bit different in hindsight. But this season has been a bit more of a balance. You see a bit of both. You don't see him being a maniacally, like the approach of trying to go for a freak result. That's not really there. But there is still calculations like, I want to extend the stint.
Yeah.
I want to do something different. If he feels that he's stuck in the field and there's nothing happening, he's more than willing to try something different. I think
This
that's
is
a very, very proactive approach.
And that's something that we, like, Hamilton has had very much faith in the team all the time to just deliver the strategies. Very much like Leclerc. And at times that's been a problem because, you know, the strategy hasn't been right or the call hasn't been there. More so for Leclerc than Hamilton. But yeah, like, look, I think the simple thing is, if this 3 seasons with Hamilton and how close George has been, you know, and been ahead, like, realistically, he has been just comfortably the better driver this season, right? Like, in reality, we look at like how close they are on points, and then forget that George this season should be kind of another 40 odd, at least 40 odd points up on where he was.
Yeah.
But he was DSQ'd and DNF'd, right? So, like, it's not close in reality in terms of things like that, right? So, look, George has been comfortably the better driver this year. And what we need to bear in mind is, like, George came into a team, like, where we're at now, this is George's 3rd season. George is still young. Like, you know, he's still kind of growing. He had 3 seasons before that at Williams. He came into Lewis's house. Lewis is leaving after 12 seasons, 8 Constructors' Championships together, and 6 titles together. Like, Lewis, regardless of the situation, should have been comfortably the better driver, and he wasn't. He just wasn't.
Yeah.
You know, like, over the course of the 3 seasons, he just wasn't. At best, they are on par in reality. That is the way to look at it. And in 2 of the 3 seasons, George was the better driver. Like, 2023 was the one where George wasn't. And like you said, there's lots of context around that. So one of 2 things have to be said. Either George is a top tier driver and he pushed Lewis and he's the younger driver and that's just the way it's going to go. Or George is only a good driver and Lewis is completely washed. And I think one of those is true. You know, George is good and Lewis is washed. No, I'm joking. It's the other one.
No, that is what it is.
No,
it's just, you know, just, I think, again, you know, getting back to that point that you were discussing earlier, I just think that George is one driver who is probably, it seems, he's destined to not get the credit that he deserves. I think we are, I think we might be heading in that direction, because realistically,
It could change very
realistically, if we
quickly
talk,
in Formula One, though.
it could,
could
yeah,
change.
I agree. It could. Because look, where George is right now, Lewis probably was in that position in 2012. Because again, a lot of people don't remember. There's a lot of historic revisionism that goes on. Lewis in 2012 was in a position where he was a sidekick to Vettel and Alonso. That's where he was. He was not getting the wins, results. Either one way or the other, things did not go well. He had his own incidents. Then there was the stuff that he did, like sharing the telemetry after Spa. You don't do these things, but the problem was he had the talent to match Alonso and Vettel, but the results were not being there. And right now, if you look at Russell, he has the talent to match a Norris or any of the top drivers. He does not have the results to show it. And I think that is
Yeah.
something that is eating on him right now, because what, Lando has now 5 wins, Russell has 3. That's a big
Yeah.
number, and you just feel that realistically, if Mercedes is in contention for the title next season, I think George will be there. I don't think Mercedes will be in contention for the title next season. I think it will be something similar to what we have this season. And once that happens, it hurts a driver like George, because I think by the end of 2025, he would realize one thing, and that is that the team, and most importantly, Toto, is being very, very protective of Kimi, and he's becoming more of a sidekick, just like he was in when Lewis was there.
Yeah.
So that's just the worry I have. And even though I think as a driver, I think he's been the better driver than Lewis in terms of the entire stint, I just think he might not get the credit for that, because again, the whole nonsense of, because look, first of all, I think Sky Sports is the worst possible broadcast option that F1 could have chosen, but they have. The nonsense around and the mollycoddling that Lewis gets, he shouldn't.
Yeah.
There have been times when he's been unprofessional this season, and there have been times in the past as well. It's just that he does not get called out, similar to what probably Alonso or a Max would.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just feel that this kind of an achievement that you've beaten, I think this is far better than what Rosberg did against Michael. Michael was washed. Michael came into Formula One with a broken neck and regulations which he had no clue about. He had not driven Formula One cars in that manner.
Yeah.
And him losing at that point, okay, understandable. But he's beating Lewis Hamilton, who he stepped into a prime Lewis Hamilton's team. I mean, again, we can say he's washed or whatever, but he basically almost won the title against Max in 2021. So it's not like he was far off his peak.
Yeah.
He's beaten that Lewis, and that has to count for something. I just think it won't. That's when I come down to it.
I think there's a very short memory in Formula One, and I think that
Yeah.
like we talked about this probably earlier this year at the start of the season, actually, and I know I definitely talked about it in podcasts like a year or two ago, where I was like, if McLaren don't pick up things quickly and Norris does stick around, for example, Norris is one of the top tier drivers, and I was saying it then, I was like, he's very, very quick. But if he doesn't start getting results soon and fighting for titles soon, that will be forgotten about very quick, because the new guys come in and the old guys who haven't achieved get forgotten about, and that could happen to Russell. The other thing is, it could turn really quickly. I mean, the thing is, like, I don't have a lot of faith in Mercedes to turn things around in these regulations. But then again, I mean, like,
You and I
realistically, but then again, realistically, like, McLaren did, and Ferrari have turned turned things around relatively quickly by the end of the season. And we are going into pretty much the same, we are going into exactly the same regulations for next year. So there is a chance that Mercedes show up with a car that, even if it's not the quickest, it is just there, and the driver can make the difference. And I think if that happens next year, Russell needs to seize that opportunity, because it could be the only chance. Like, I think a lot of fans are a bit, because of 2014, they think that 2026 will be Mercedes year. I don't think so. I really don't. So
I think ideally I would I would suggest George talk to Alonso, see if the seat opens up at Aston. His contract ends with Mercedes at the end of 2025. I'd suggest move to Aston Martin, be your team's first driver rather than the second stepson. That's just the way I see it.
But realistically, what he should do is just, he needs to assess things by halfway through the season next year. I mean, if he's fighting for a title next year, fine. Fight for the title. Stick with Mercedes for 26, see what happens.
Yeah.
If Mercedes are nowhere next year, then at least see what the options are. Because if they're nowhere next year, there's a good chance they won't be anywhere either in 2026. Because realistically, like, the engine will be the same engine that is in the McLaren, for example.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, McLaren have a better aero team at the minute than Mercedes do. So, it's not like the old works days where you have the customer has an engine that is significantly worse than the works team. They will be on parity engine wise anyway. So it's like, who's better at aero? And at the moment, that's McLaren, 100%. So, let's see.